I'll get on. Well, hello everyone who's out there. Is anybody out there? Check in if you're out there. We're live here for another Google Hangout and Ask Me Anything about God and morality. So now we need to make sure we're on board technically here. How do I see the Q&A? Do I click on there we go. Okay, so I think I think I'm all set. I've got my Starbucks Frappuccino, got my caffeine and my sugar, so I'm ready to go. But so this is another Ask Me Anything, but the topic is God and morality. So it's not just Ask Me Anything, but Ask Me Anything that kind of pertains to God and morality. And we want to kind of focus it in on that topic tonight. What I've learned in the very unique mission trips that I do to Berkeley and to Utah, but particularly when we go to Berkeley and we engage with atheists. So what we do, if you're not familiar with the Berkeley mission trip, is we will train a group of young people, train them in apologetics and tactics, and then we'll take them to Berkeley and we will create a unique mission trip, a kind of customized itinerary so that those students can then engage with the apologetic material they've learned. They can engage with atheists. The very first year we went up there, when we brought our atheist guests out, what we did is we said, hey, give us your best shot. Tell us why you think Christianity is false. And what they ended up doing is throwing out 50,000, objections and issues. And it was difficult to kind of pick up all the pieces, and you're just all over the place. And so what we learned is to say, okay, let's take one topic and let's explore that. And let's go kind of deep in that topic and address kind of all the relevant issues. And so we learn to kind of hone in on the topic. And so that's kind of what we're doing here, is we want to deal with the topic of God and morality and maybe the issues and questions that surround that particular topic, so that we don't get on 50,000 different topics and all these different rabbit trails. Okay, so it's an Ask Me Anything about God and morality. Now, if you want to ask questions, you can ask questions on the Google Hangout here. If you are watching in the Google Hangout, you can type in your questions and they will pop up on the side screen, and we'll kind of deal with those. Some people have already sent in some questions. Some have, you can also, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can watch this on YouTube. You can submit questions in the comment section of YouTube. And my partners here at Stand to Reason, Brooke and Amy, are going to help filter those questions to me. You can also leave a question or comment in our blog, the Stand to Reason blog, and ask questions through that. Or Twitter. If you use Twitter, just make sure you use the hashtag #STRask, and we'll filter through some of those. Now, I already noticed that some of those questions on the #STRask hashtag aren't related to this topic, so we won't be going into those questions. So make sure you ask questions that are related to the topic of God and morality. If you're using Snapchat, you can Snapchat us. No, I'm just kidding. You can't Snapchat us. Okay. All right, let me just say a few things in opening, and then we'll kind of deal with questions as they come. We'll go to about 7:30 on this and go for about an hour or so. But I think it's important for those of us who are in apologetics and who study these things and engage in these things and engage in these kind of conversations and think carefully about these issues, that we remember to constantly be translators. Right? I think it's important for us not to kind of simply become apologetic junkies. And I know there's a blog called Apologetic Junkies, and no, I'm not making any comment on that blog, because that name might not necessarily characterize what I'm going to characterize when I talk about an apologetic junkie. But there are those of us who go to conferences and read books and and are engage in the dialogue and the conversation and the debate, and that's all good. But I think we need to realize that there's some really key purposes to apologetics. One would be, of course, for the building up of the faith of believers, to give them confidence in what we believe is actually true. And then also, as we engage a skeptical world, a secular world, a non-believing world. And so I think in both those instances, for those non-apologetic junkie types, for the non-apologetic experts who aren't into it like we are, we have to constantly translate. And so I think it's important for us to translate on this particular issue as best we can, because I think morality can be a powerful argument for God's existence. It can give believers confidence that God really is there. There's a very powerful argument that God exists. And of course, there's lots of implications then for that. But then also, I think it's a good argument that unbelievers can find compelling as an argument for God's existence. Okay, so we need to translate. And so, of course, just at the outset, when it comes to this topic of God and morality, we have to make sure that we make a careful distinction up front. And it's a philosophical distinction that we're going to have to do some translating for people. And for those of you who have kind of explored the issue of God and morality, you're probably aware of the basic distinction that you need to make up front, and that's the distinction between two branches of philosophy, metaphysics and epistemology. Right, so epistemology is simply the study of knowledge. We're asking, what do we know? How do we know it? What counts as knowledge? These kind of questions. Metaphysics is a branch of philosophy that studies reality and asks the question, what is real? And so when we are looking at this issue of God and morality, the epistemological question might be something like, how do we know morality? But the theist, the Christian, is interested in a more foundational question primarily, and that is, what is the basis for morality? What's the foundation for this thing? Not just can we know it? And of course, the skeptic wants to respond and say, and often will confuse this issue. And I'm going to illustrate it for you in a second here, but we'll confuse the issue and say, well, look, I'm an unbeliever. I don't believe in God's existence, and yet I can act morally. I can know moral truths. And to that, we want to say, yes, of course. The atheist, the skeptic, the unbeliever, the person from another religion, yes, they can act morally. That is not our claim, that atheists or skeptics don't act morally. In fact, I tell my atheist friends, hey, look, you can be just as moral as me. You could be more moral than me. I'm not claiming anything about your ability to know moral truth or to act morally. Those are the epistemological issues. What we're focused on when we start making the case that God is the foundation of morality, we're interested in the metaphysics. We're interested in the question of what grounds this thing. Okay, so now those are philosophical categories. How do we illustrate this? Well, here's an illustration I like to use. Let's say a friend is reading the newspaper, and they're sitting at Starbucks, and you walk in and you say, hey, what's up? And go over and say, hey, what are you reading? Say, oh, I'm reading something on I don't know, some political issue, what's going on in the Middle East with ISIS or something like that. I'm reading an article on ISIS. And then you respond and say, oh, who wrote the article? And the person says, no one wrote the article. You say, what do you mean no one wrote the article? You're reading an article, so who wrote it, right? You're asking for the explanation of the existence of that article, right? Who's the writer? The person says, well, I don't have to believe in writers to read this article. Well, think about that statement. I don't have to believe in authors or writers to read the article. Is that true? Well, yeah, of course that's true. You don't have to believe in authors to read articles. You could believe that authors don't exist and still read articles. And that kind of illustrates the epistemological issue, right? You don't have to believe in God to be moral. But what we're asking is, look, if you've got something like an article the existence of an article needs an explanation, right? What's the grounding of that thing? What is the foundation of that thing? Where does that thing come from? Where does that article come from? Seems like the best explanation for articles is an author. Before you know, an author or a writer best explains or grounds an article. And so can somebody not believe in writers and still read articles? Yes. Can someone not believe in God and still be moral? Yes. But what we're saying is, look, if you think there's this thing, morality, if there's an article, the best explanation is a writer. If there is morality, the best explanation is a moral being like God. Okay, and so that's a very important distinction we make up front, and kind of kick off our conversation here on God and morality. And so that's how we need to talk about this when we're making the argument that God is the best foundation for morality. God is the best explanation for morality. Okay, so that kind of gets us kicked off. Send in your questions on Twitter, YouTube, the STR blog, in the in the Google Hangout here, and we'll deal with some of these. Okay, so here's one. Let's deal with this one. This is a good question. It says, please explain why God, being the author of life, gives him the moral. As being the author of life, how does that give him the moral authority to take life? Contrast this to the example of a parent taking the life of their children. Thanks. Okay, that's a good question. And so there's I think a couple issues to think about there. We want to think about, okay, this one kind of already assumes that God is the foundation of morality. Okay, and I think we'd want to say it's God's morality is rooted in God's nature, his good nature. So something like a moral value, like love or kindness, is rooted in the character of God. All right. Now, from his character flow commands. And so God will issue moral commands. And from those moral commands, we then have duties or obligations to obey those commands. And so God says it is wrong to take innocent life. And so that's a command. Do not murder. Then we have a duty. There's a corresponding duty to that command. The obligation, the duty that I have is not to murder. I have an obligation not to take innocent life without justification. Now, God himself, no one is issuing God moral commands, right? He is the source. His character is a source of moral value, and his character is then the source of moral commands. He's the one who issues moral commands, but no one is issuing God moral commands. So therefore, he doesn't have any duties to anyone else. He just acts consistently with his nature. So he doesn't have an obligation not to take life. He doesn't have obligations to anyone or anything because no one's issuing him commands. I think now, okay, so back to so I think that gives a little foundation here. So that God doesn't have an obligation to take life or not take life. I think another thing to think about on this one is how, and I think the example of a parent and a child doesn't give us a direct parallel to God and human creatures, because in one sense, I'm not the one who is creating life in the sense that God has created life and everything is kind of obligated to him in that sense. I have my obligations to my children actually are obligations. I take care of my children because I have this greater duty to God. You see, my obligations to my children are in virtue of my obligations to God. So that's So that's different. God doesn't have obligations to human beings in virtue of some larger obligation to someone else or something else. He just is the author of life, and he is the source of all goodness. His moral character is the source of all goodness. And so in that sense, the example is not a direct parallel, but it seems like as the author of life, number one, if he is a moral being, then that he would, when he takes life, there are good grounds to do so. He would be morally justified, or he would act. Maybe a better way to put it is that he would act consistently with his nature in the giving or taking of life. Another way to think about it is maybe a better parallel than that analogy would be someone creating maybe a piece of pottery, right? So if I make a piece of pottery, let's say I make a little vase or something, and I form that, and it's my creation. There's a sense where I have the right to take that and put that up on my mantle and display it. Or if I want, I have the right to kind of take that and kind of smash it, right? And now you don't have the right to come over and take it and smash it, but I, as the creator of that thing, have the right to take and smash that pottery if I want. And so that may be a better analogy versus the parent-kid analogy. And so so I think maybe I'm trying to get at the why of, why being the author of life gives him the moral authority to take life. Well, I think he is the greatest moral being. He is the source of all morality, and he doesn't have obligations to anyone. Okay. All right. Let's look at another question here. We'll try to move maybe a little more quickly through some of these questions. There was one. Okay, let me find the question. I thought there was a really good one that was asked in. It was asked in the questions. Let's see. Oh, there it is. Paul Harrison asked a question. He said, in Paul Copan's "Is God a Moral Monster?" he makes the argument that Old Testament ethics were situational, as God was meeting them where they were and building a set-apart nation. Those laws were not meant to be followed for all time. For instance, Moses gave them divorce because of their hard hearts, but Jesus said only in the case of infidelity can a couple divorce. So here's the question. If God's moral commands are based on his perfect and unchanging nature, how can he endorse any less than a perfect command, then update it later? Does God have the freedom to choose to condescend from his own perfect nature for our sake? I would think yes to that last question. Yes, I agree. Israel's laws were they were not perfect, or they do not adequately express maybe God's moral will. I think the example of Jesus is a great example. Jesus regarded the Mosaic law on divorce as inadequate, so it fails to capture God's ideal for marriage. But this was, it seems to me, this kind of ideal gets historically conditioned, if you will, by maybe the moral callousness of the people who this ideal is given to. So here's the point. It seems to me that God's commands can be contingent upon the realities of the human condition. Now remember, what I said earlier, his moral nature, he is perfect in his moral nature, right? And the moral values that are an expression of his nature are perfect. But then he gives commands into a certain context. So the commands are not the same thing as the nature, but the commands are issued in accordance with the nature, but the commands are issued relative to the time and place of the recipients of those commands. So you got real people in real circumstances, and they may not be capable of receiving or carrying out God's moral ideals for them, So God can adjust his commands and give them a command that may be much less than ideal, but nonetheless, these commands are suited for the reality of the situation, right? And maybe for the moral status of that person. It's almost like, I was trying to think of an analogy for this, but it's like with my kids. When my kids are younger and I'm trying to give them moral instruction, I don't express the ideal, right? And so I don't always express the ideal. I kind of take my kids where they're at in their moral development. And so for my younger kids, I might emphasize, hey, tell the truth. Now, what if they tell the truth because there's some kind of selfish motive behind it? Well, I'm still going to be happy with the fact that they told the truth. I think that could be moral progress that gets you towards the ideal. Now, eventually, I want to get to the discussion about their motives, right? And having proper motives and taking right action with right motive and putting those things together. But with my 3-year-old son, Jonah, I might just be happy with the fact that he told the truth, even if he had some kind of improper motive at that point. And I'll work with him on that. There'll be progress that I want to make, but even though he doesn't meet my ideal, the command I issue to him is kind of suited for his situation as a 3-year-old little boy in my home. So it seems like, I think Paul Copan's book does a good job of demonstrating that Old Testament laws are historically conditioned to particular people at a particular time in a particular place. So in that sense, these objective moral values and these commands are relative to the situation, meaning kind of what moral duties and commands come into play, or relative to this particular, the particular details of the circumstances, and that these, they were never intended to be ethical principles that govern all peoples at all times under all circumstances. So God gives ancient Israel laws that are suited to their historical circumstances, even if it doesn't express his moral will. And so, yeah, I think that's consistent, and I think that's okay. God takes us where we're at. He takes us and works with us and works with humanity. And so I don't think that is inconsistent with his perfect moral nature. Yeah, so I think that's what I would say on that one. I think it's a good question. All right. Okay, so let's go to another question. All right, so let me kind of look through some of these questions here. Okay, so here's one. How should we treat people? Oh, let's see, it just scrolled up. Okay, where'd that one go? Okay, so how should we treat people who seem to be borrowing from the Christian belief but denies they are doing so? So I'm guessing how maybe someone who has a worldview, and this I think would be the Christian claim, is that this would be my claim, is that the person, let's say the atheist or the skeptic, whose worldview can't ground morality, but wants to affirm objective morality, and so we would say, well, their worldview doesn't have the resources to give you objective morality. So but they want to affirm objective morality. So what are they doing? Well, they're borrowing from my worldview. They're borrowing from the Christian worldview. They're borrowing from theism to give them what their worldview can't give them. So how do we treat those people, even when they deny that they're doing so? Well, okay, I mean, how do you treat those people? I'm not quite sure what you mean by how do you treat those people. Of course, you treat them with respect and kindness. Maybe the issue is that how do you treat them in terms of maybe dealing with that? How do you help show them the inadequacy of that? So this is, I think, where we're looking at, hey, there's this fact about the world, right? There seem to be objective moral values and duties. And we seem to be able to recognize that. And I can affirm, no matter what I ground it in at this point, we can say, hey, look, where's the common ground? And maybe that's if that's what you mean by how do you treat someone, how do you move forward in this conversation, I would say maybe just affirm the common ground that we have with people. So if someone affirms that raping women is morally wrong, that abusing women and children is morally wrong, murdering innocent people is morally wrong, we have some common ground. And I think maybe that's something to affirm and to say, look, okay, we agree with that. And I agree that you can know moral truth. Okay, but then I think what you want to do is say, okay, we got this common ground. There are these moral facts. There's the objective moral values and duties. Then the question is maybe kind of inspecting those, right? And saying, well, let's think about the nature of these things. And as we think about what these things really are, can we offer maybe a better explanation for these than other explanations that are offered? So for instance, so here's trying to kind of cash this out in an example, translate for people. Okay, so let's think about a moral obligation, right? A moral command and a moral obligation. So let's say I'm sitting in a Chinese food restaurant. I'm eating my Chinese food and a delicious meal, and I'm finished. What do they bring me at the end of that meal? They bring me fortune cookies, right? And the fortune cookies are a lot of fun. You open up crack open the cookie. Usually the cookie's not very good. Set that aside. You just want to read the fortune. My kids just want to read the fortune. And so you read the fortune. Now imagine that the fortune says, that little piece of paper in the cookie says, get up and leave now. Now that's a command, right? But think about it. If you saw a fortune cookie that issued a command, do you also kind of feel this obligation? Do you sense there's an obligation to obey that command that's kind of been issued forth from the fortune cookie? No, it doesn't seem like there's an obligation there to obey that command. Now, let's say you're at the end of the meal, and there's a lady at a table sitting next to you, and she says to you, hey, get up and leave now. Notice the same command, but do you experience an obligation to then get up and leave at that point? Well, no, I'm guessing you're going to ask a question. You might say, why? Or you might ask, who are you? Now, what if you say, who are you, ma'am? And she says, I'm just another customer here, but I want you and your family to get up and leave now. Are you going to get up and leave now? I don't think so. I mean, you might get up and leave just because you don't want to deal with that. But is there an obligation for you to get up and leave now because this other customer has commanded it? No. Okay, now what if that same lady says, or the lady says, get up and leave now, and then you say, well, why? Who are you? And she says, well, I'm an undercover FBI agent. We're doing a major drug sting right now. We're about to bust the owner of this restaurant. You better get up and leave now. Do you get up and leave now? Is there an obligation now to get up and leave now? Yeah, I think so. Now think about it. In that situation, you have the same command. Get up and leave now. Same command in all three situations. But why is there an obligation in the last situation to obey that command? And there's not an obligation to obey that command in the first two instances, when it comes out of the fortune cookie or when the command comes from another customer. What's the difference that then seems to bring into existence this obligation? Well, it seems that there's an appropriate authority behind the command. And so as we kind of explore that, it seems like commands that come with corresponding obligations have to be backed up by some authority, right? Some person with authority. Of course, we don't have obligation. Inanimate objects can't give commands. Commands only come from commanders, right? I don't have obligations to inanimate objects. I don't have an obligation to a rock. I can pick up a rock outside and I can throw it. I don't have any obligations. Of course, I can't pick up that rock and throw it at you and hit you. I have an obligation not to harm you, right? And so there's another aspect. So not only Is there an appropriate authority? But it's a person with the appropriate authority. And then obligations only seem to make sense in the context of two persons who are kind of standing in a relationship to one another, right? So you've got to have a context of persons. You got to have a person with the appropriate, or the appropriate authority, moral authority, and then there's an obligation. So as we're thinking through that, we think, wait, okay, there seem to be these commands that govern the universe, and we have obligations. We have obligations not to murder innocent people for no reason whatsoever. Okay, well, who am? And there's the who. Who am I obligated to, or what am I obligated to? Well, actually, the what am I obligated to doesn't seem to make sense of the obligation. Who am I obligated to? If I indeed have that obligation, well, it seems like a person with the appropriate authority, someone like God. And so I think that's kind of maybe how I would move forward with a person who is wants to affirm objective moral values and duties and obligations, but denies that they're doing so. I would just want to say, hey, look, this doesn't seem to fit in your worldview. So there is no, in the atheistic worldview, there is no who that you're obligated to. But in the Christian worldview, there is a who that we're obligated to. And so this idea of moral obligation fits better in our worldview. And that's why I would suggest that you're borrowing from it. And just you're trying to help them see that it's almost like, think about a puzzle. Okay, here's the atheist puzzle, the atheist worldview. And you have this piece of the puzzle, objective moral values and duties. Saying, look, it doesn't fit in that puzzle. You can't force it in there. It doesn't fit. But over here in the Christian worldview, it does fit, and here's why. So I think that's, hopefully I understood the question correctly. But I think that would be maybe helpful in moving forward on that one. Okay. Wow. Okay. A lot more questions here. Okay. So this is from Lance. Do you think God is necessary for moral facts being objective? And if so, how would you defend this claim? How are theistic theories of moral ontology able to account for these important characteristics? Well, it seems to me that God, so God is the proper grounding, helps us to understand kind of these important characteristics of objective morality. Okay, so you have moral values, right? And we want to say, when we say, so I think it's important to understand what we mean by objective, right? By objective, they are mind independent, or they are true whether anyone believes them or not, right? So you have the moral value of love and kindness, or something like that. These are true whether you believe them or not. Kindness has always been a virtue, and so the implication is that this thing is transcendent. So this would be one of the characteristics of something being objectively good. It would be transcendent. It transcends human cultures. It transcends time, right? So it's not just a cultural construction, but it transcends the determinations of a culture. It transcends the individuals in a culture. So it'd be transcendent. So if this thing is transcendent, right? If objective moral values are transcendent, then we would need to find a source that is sufficient to explain its transcendence, right? And so God would be a transcendent being who would explain the transcendence of moral values, right? And so I think So the existence of God and his moral nature helps us to account for those important characteristics. Yeah, so I think that's what I'd say. You know, you look at again, kind of looking at the whole idea of a command, right? A command is explained by a person with appropriate authority who is a commander. And so in that sense, that characteristic of morality is explained by a person like God who has the appropriate authority to issue commands that are consistent with his nature. So so I think it's kind of looking at the details, and the source is sufficient. God, as a source of morality, is sufficient to account for these characteristics we discover in the world of morality. We see morality, and that's what we kind of do. There's this fact of morality. We start kind of inspecting it for its characteristics, and of course, then those characteristics help point to the best explanation of the grounding of them, right? And this is where I think atheistic accounts would fail. Atheistic explanations would fail because you have kind of morality arising from a non-moral source. You're getting value from a valueless source, right? You're getting, you can't get those things. Those aren't sufficient. More evolution, atheism they don't have the resources to give you these characteristics that we discover about morality. Okay, so thanks for that question, Lance. Good question. All right, let's keep moving here. Yeah, okay, so here's a good question. Are there any judgments? I think this is from Scott Richardson. Are there any judgments from God nowadays for immorality as there were in the Old Testament, or are we free from his judgment now? Well, I guess I'd say a couple things. Number one, the Old Testament is describing God's relationship with Israel, right? It's describing what God is trying to accomplish through the nation of Israel. So there's specific purposes and plans for the nation of Israel that God doesn't have for a particular nation nowadays, right? And so God was choosing to set apart a people for himself that he would then bless all the peoples of the world through, right? The whole Abrahamic covenant. And so he attempts to carry that out through the nation of Israel. And so his relationship with them is special, and the commands that he gives them are specific to their historical situation, and the corresponding judgments, I think, are for those particular historical circumstances. So I don't think the judgments of the Old Testament in relation to the nation of Israel stand for us today. So I don't think we can claim that, these judgments laid out in the Old Testament for the nation of Israel somehow have application to us. Now, could it be that God does judge immorality and offers, specific judgments on immoral behavior? Well, that could be, but we would have the problem of knowing that. How do we know? So this is when when a Christian leader comes out and pronounces God's judgment on the United States because of our behavior, right? Some act, some natural disaster is a judgment from God for America's immorality. My question is, how would you know such a thing? How would you know that? Unless unless God somehow communicates that to us. So it's just possible that there could be judgments from God for immorality, not like there were in the Old Testament, I don't think, because that was, again, a specific relationship with the nation of Israel and God's specific purposes for the nation of Israel. But God could offer judgments on immorality. But how would we know? I don't think there's any way that we could confidently say, yes, this particular action is God's judgment on, this country or that country for these particular actions. We just wouldn't know that. Now, are we free from his judgment now? Well, it depends on what you mean by that. In one sense, no, because in the sense that there are consequences for our actions. I mean, there are natural consequences for our actions that really is grounded in God. That would say, no, we're not free from judgment in that sense, right? If we are designed by God and he has certain intentions for us morally, and we choose not to act in those ways, we act inconsistent with how we've been designed to act morally, well, then there are going to be consequences. It's kind of like, if I have a washing machine at home, okay, here's maybe an analogy to help explain this. But if I have a washing machine at home, there's a manual that tells me how to operate that washing machine, right? And there was a designer who designed that washing machine, and he designed it in such a way that it's supposed to function in a particular kind of way. So if I go into my garage and grab all of my dirty tools and take those over to my washer and dump them in my washer and say, I want to clean my tools, put them in my washer, I'm using that washing machine in a way it wasn't intended to function. And so guess what's going to happen? There are going to be consequences, right? It's going to break down. And I think in the same way, we could say, as designed beings, our designer has certain intentions for us, certain ways in which we are to act, and those ways are moral ways, consistent with him and his good, holy, nature. When we act inconsistent with his nature and with his commands, then we break down. So, and you see this, with sin, and you look at kind of sociological studies that will demonstrate, people who live, promiscuous lives or something like that. There are consequences that couples that cohabitate. There are consequences to that behavior for relationships. The rates of divorce and the reporting of distrust and those kind of things. The breakdown of that relationship is much more likely. So there are consequences. So in that sense, if that's what you mean by judgment, yes. Is there a specific judgment that God is kind of directly causing? Well, could be, but we can know that. Okay. All right. Thanks for the question, Scott. Okay, let's scroll through. Wow, it's already 7:15. I don't think I've taken one drink of my coffee. All right, while we've been talking. You want one of those? Oh, are they? So apparently I did something unethical. I stole one of Amy and Brooke's Frappuccinos. They were in the refrigerator. I saw no name attached to them. So I'm going to have to do some moral reasoning here with these ladies. Okay, let's move on. Okay, what is the strongest? This is from 3 Exile Last. What is the strongest argument for God? I think but it says by morality. I think you mean from morality. What is the strongest argument for God from morality? Well, okay. I guess let's. I'm not quite sure exactly what that means. What's the strongest argument for God? I think the moral argument is a strong argument for God. What's the moral argument? Well, of course, there's the formal argument, right? If you might say, if objective moral values exist, then God exists. Objective moral values exist, therefore God exists, right? So that's kind of your deductive argument. Now, of course, we don't talk this way to normal people, right? We don't talk in terms of premises and conclusion. It's good to think in these ways and to know the arguments and that kind of thing. But let me just kind of, how do we talk about these things with kind of normal people, your neighbor, your family members or friends who, don't have formal training in philosophy? Well, here's the way I like to think about it. You start with obvious truths, right? You start with an obvious truth, And so what might be an obvious truth when it comes to morality? Well, hopefully, it is wrong to torture children for fun. It is wrong to torture children for the pure pleasure of it, right? Hopefully that's an obvious moral truth. Now, no, okay, I actually was engaging with an atheist on Twitter this week who was asking, like, why do we add the for fun part? Why do we add the, for pleasure part? That's simply just to clarify. Okay, so if I say it's wrong to torture children, someone could offer some complex scenario where the torturing of one child saved 10 million lives or something like that. And so then you would have a case where it'd be justified to torture a child. Okay, so when I add for fun, that's simply to eliminate that kind of option, just to make this as clear as possible. Okay, there's not some moral justification to be offered. The reason why you're torturing this child is for the pure pleasure of torturing children. Okay, so I just want to be real clear here. So is it wrong to torture children for fun? Hopefully the response is yes. Okay, again, what am I trying to do? I'm trying to establish some common ground. And it could be, it could be a host of things. Is it wrong to rape women? Is it wrong to, to practice racism on a daily basis? Is it wrong to murder people for no reason? Okay, these kind of things. These are what we call obvious moral truths. We can establish some of these. We have some common ground. The person affirms them. Then what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, so we've kind of reflected and we realize there are these objective moral facts out there. They're not dependent on human preferences. They're not dependent on human subjects. They exist. They're transcendent, on and on and on. Then the question is, what's the best explanation? So I think kind of first step is saying, hey, do we have common ground? Do we both affirm the existence of objective moral facts, real moral facts? Here's some examples. Okay, if we just have one of those, then we have some common ground. We both hold that there are objective moral truths. Okay, then the question is, where would such a thing come from, right? And now, of course, if the person wants to deny their objective moral facts, the other option is some kind of moral subjectivism, right? Morality is relative to the subject. And then, of course, we would go that route in dealing with kind of the moral relativism. But if they hold that there are these real objective moral facts, which I think a lot of people when pressed will hold, we'll come to that conclusion. Then the question is, where does this come from? What explains it? That's the argument. And that's what you're trying to help them see, is the best grounding, the best explanation, the appropriate basis for this thing is God's existence, right? So think about, grounding. It's kind of like, I plant flowers at my house, right? Some flowers require a certain kind of soil to grow up out of. I just planted some tomatoes and they require, moist soil all the time or else they will die. Well, that's kind of the whole idea of grounding, right? What's the kind of soil or explanation that gives rise to this thing that you discover morality? I see the flower, I see it, morality. Okay, so what's the grounding that best explains this thing? That's what you're trying to do. And so, so I think the strongest argument is just pointing to is kind of appealing to people's basic moral sense. It's what Paul talks about in Romans 2, right? The Gentile who does not know the law, he knows the law instinctively because it's written on his heart. So so we know from Scripture we have common ground with the unbeliever in that God's moral law is written on our hearts. We have the ability, we have the moral equipment to recognize moral truths. We have moral intuitions, right? Just like I have eyes that help me perceive the world around me, I have the ability, I have sense perception, right? I'll walk outside and I may see a dog in front of me. I say, there's a dog, right? I see it. In the same way, I think we want to make that appeal to people's moral sense. They have this other faculty, this moral sense, this moral common sense. And they don't see some object physically. No, they reflect. So it's a different kind of seeing. They reflect. Their intuitions kind of rise to the surface, and they just see these self-evident truths, right? These self-evident moral truths. And then the question is, if we have that common ground, okay, what best explains this. So that's how I'd make the argument to just kind of the man on the street, right? The non-philosophically trained. And if we have that common ground, then the question is, okay, where's it come from? All right, good question. Let's take another one. There's a lot of questions here. I'm trying to scroll through them. Let's see, that one I don't think. Sorry, Bill. That one is not really related to the topic, so I'm going to skip that one. Okay, here's one that's interesting. This is from Neil on Twitter. How should Christians balance voting on moral issues while maintaining religious freedom for all? I'm worried about being inconsistent. That's a great question. It's a little more of I think a little more difficult question. I think the kind of the philosophical question, the apologetic question of making a case for God for morality is easier than this one. This is where I think in a free society like ours, there's a balance between morality and the common good and freedom that you have to hold. I mean, because we could say, right, something like, lying is morally wrong. But now, should we then legislate against lying? Well, in certain circumstances we do, but not in all circumstances, right? So if if my friend lies to me about something, about borrowing, maybe that's not a good example. My friend lies to me about where he was at on Saturday night. I don't call the cops and say, "Man, this guy's immoral." He broke, he didn't break a law. Wait, he might be immoral, but he didn't break a law. Now, why wouldn't we? Why would we not have laws for every single immoral thing? Well, because you're balancing this between kind of free individuals in a society. And I think, again, and this is a much more difficult question, but I think we have to kind of look at, we certainly want to advocate for what we hold to be the right moral issues. So we advocate for for moral issues, and we advocate more strongly for those that seem to have greater consequences for the common good. So, for instance, something like the nature of marriage, right, and same-sex marriage. This is something where I think there's good reason to vigorously propose, constitutional amendments or things like that to legislate, regarding that particular issue, because there are huge consequences for kind of overturning, God's order on marriage, right? So, and I guess on that topic, I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, but right there now on that topic, we would say, and maybe here's another way to think about it: government takes kind of three stances towards a particular issues. They either promote, they permit, or they prohibit, right? So there's some actions they prohibit, there's some actions they promote, and there's some actions they simply permit. So we do think that, look, people have the freedom, men have the freedom to marry other men, but the government doesn't necessarily have an obligation to promote that, right? Government has a good reason to promote heterosexual marriage because of children, right? This is the best environment to raise children. This gives us the next generation. And so government could say, yeah, we're going to promote that. They don't prohibit same-sex marriages, in that someone can hold a ceremony, they can exchange rings, they can do all that. And so they permit it because there's a kind of a balance between morality and human freedom. And we kind of want to say, well, look, human beings, we can't legislate every moral thing. Those things that seem to have greater consequences, yes, we want to propose laws and deal with moral issues there, and yet we want to also help maintain freedom. So those are some thoughts on that. I think that's a really difficult question. There are some issues that, Christians who disagree on some of those things. So anyway, those are some thoughts that maybe push that conversation a little bit forward a little bit more. Okay, let's take one more. It's already 7:26. Gosh, 4 minutes left. Let's see if there's one more that we could take. Okay, yeah, I think this is a good question to end on. What's the best written work outside of the scriptures that you have read on the topic of God and morality if we want to study this topic further? That's from Scott Kelly. That's a great question to end on. Okay, yeah, in 1 hour we can address just a few questions, and hopefully it's been helpful for you. It's been a good challenge for me to try and think through, how to push some of these conversations forward a little bit. Of course, obviously, there's just lots of issues around this particular topic. So, what are some more resources on this? Okay, let me think. And Amy, if you've got any suggestions for resources, bring those to my mind. But definitely one very good source, one of the Christian philosophers who's done a lot of work on this topic is Paul Copan. And you can actually go to paulcopan.com and just scroll through his list of articles there. He's got a number of different articles that he has written on this particular issue, some engagements or some kind of back and forth with an atheist in particular, Michael Martin. They've gone back and forth on this. So I think Paul's work is good. If you kind of want to look at the philosophical issues here and the grounding of morality and God, Paul has some good stuff on that. And he also is a good translator too. So some of the more popular level stuff, he deals with this stuff very well. The book is God a Moral Monster. That's a good resource. So I'd offer that. Another great resource, I think, of course, STR, our website, and the articles we have there. We have some good articles on the issue of morality, particularly when it comes to evolutionary ethics, which I was actually surprised we didn't get more questions on evolutionary ethics. But we've got some good resources there. And there's some other good things on the website on STR that has to do with morality and some of the questions surrounding morality. I did a debate with a professor, Dr. Richard Green, about 1.5 years ago. And one of the things I did for preparation for that was I went to Bill Craig's website, reasonablefaith.org, and I think I did a search from under morality. I probably did a couple searches, but one would be like morality, one might have been ethics, and then of course in the search brought up all the different articles and things that are on that website that deal with it. And what I did is I just copied and pasted all these different questions that people asked about that topic, the different articles that are on there on Bill's site, and I created a document. It was like a 40-page document. Part of what I did in preparation for that debate on morality was just reading through that, and that was really helpful for me. So that might be something to do. And Bill has some great questions of the week where he deals with a lot of these kinds of, just deals with all kinds of issues surrounding morality and objective morality, grounded in God, and all that stuff. So that'd be another one. I'm trying to think of is there a more popular level book that you can think of? I can't think of anything on the top of my head. It'd be great to write an ambassador's guide on this one. That'd be a good topic to do. Yeah, I can't think of. Yeah, if you're interested in a good, oh no, that would be a good resource. Anyway, that probably is a good place to start. Paul Copan stuff, our website, str.org, and then reasonablefaith.org. I think those would be some good resources to get a little bit deeper into this issue. Okay, thanks for the question, Scott, and I'll leave you guys with that. Again, hopefully we've been able to explore this issue a little bit more in depth, give you some things to think about, try to put some handles on some of these kind of complex issues, right? You get philosophical. My challenge to you is to try and figure out ways to illustrate these kind of things. Particularly as you engage with your friends and family. This can be your non-Christian coworkers. This particular issue can be a good argument for God's existence, can be a good pointer for people to the fact that God is real. It can get you in good conversations about the fact that there is objective morality, right? Because I think the default position for many in our culture is some kind of subjectivism when it comes to morality, and we have to disabuse people of that. Our youth, in particular, are just default relativists, and so just being able to make the case that there are moral truths and that we know them is a huge start with young people. So anyway, hopefully this was helpful. We'll look forward to the next Google Hangout, the next Ask Me Anything event, and maybe explore another topic. So thanks for hanging out with us. An hour flew by with you guys, but I look forward to the next time. We will see you then. Thanks a lot for tuning in.